A routine food delivery turned into a discovery that would haunt this driver forever. The boy who opened the door looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His hollow eyes held a secret that made the delivery man's blood run cold. What he saw inside that house would force him to make the most difficult phone call of his life. But by then, it was almost too late. The truth behind those walls would expose a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight, in an ordinary suburban neighborhood where nobody asked questions. Before this emotional story begins, leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe for good karma. Now, let's go back to that winter evening when Mike Anderson was making his final delivery of the night, unaware that the next few minutes would change multiple lives forever. A routine food delivery turned into a discovery that would haunt this driver's soul forever. The boy who opened the door looked like a shadow of what a child should be. His skeletal frame and hollow eyes made the delivery man blink several times, refusing to believe what he was seeing. What awaited behind that door would leave a permanent mark on his conscience. But by then, the darkness had already taken root. The truth inside that quiet, suffocating house would expose a reality that no one wanted to face, hidden in plain sight, where neighbors turned blind eyes. Before this emotional story begins, leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe for good karma. Mike Anderson had been making deliveries all night, moving from house to house almost on autopilot. It was just another shift in the hectic life of someone who survived on delivery jobs. But something about this last stop felt different, a discomfort that would cling to his soul in a way he could never have predicted. As he parked in front of the house, he already sensed something was off. The street, eerily quiet, seemed to suffocate the atmosphere with an air of abandonment. The house stood dark and still, unlike anything he'd seen on his regular routes. What awaited him behind that door would change his life forever. When Mike rang the doorbell, he heard light footsteps on the other side. The door opened slowly, revealing a child. But not just any child. What he saw made him freeze for a moment. The boy who appeared before him looked like a shadow of what he should be. His skin was incredibly pale, as if the sun hadn't touched him in weeks, and his eyes, oh, those eyes, carried a weight far too heavy for someone so young. He was terribly thin, almost skeletal, with arms so frail that Mike had to blink several times to make sure he was seeing correctly. The feeling that something was terribly wrong gripped him immediately. "Are you okay, kid?" Mike's voice carried a concern he couldn't hide. The question came out automatically, but his heart already knew that whatever the answer, it wouldn't ease the unease he felt. The boy, however, just shrugged, as if he was used to dealing with that kind of indifference. "Yes, everything's fine," he responded quickly and coldly, grabbing the food package without even looking at Mike properly. And before Mike could react, the door closed with a dull thud, leaving the delivery man standing there in the stillness of the night. For a moment, Mike stood frozen, processing what had just happened. The image of the boy wouldn't leave his mind, the fragility of that thin body, the expression of utter exhaustion, and those eyes. Those lifeless eyes, like someone who had seen too much. The discomfort he felt began to grow inside him, making him look at the closed door with a sense of urgency. Something wasn't right in that house. Something screamed danger, but at the same time, it seemed to be wrapped in an unbearable cloak of silence. Mike slowly returned to his car, but the feeling of alertness wouldn't leave him. As he started the engine, his mind was elsewhere, fixated on the image of the boy. "How does someone let a child get to that state?" he murmured to himself, the weight of responsibility starting to suffocate him. There had been something about that delivery that refused to let Mike sleep. He tried to dismiss it, to convince himself that he was overreacting, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that boy's haunted face. The night was long and restless. The memories of what he'd witnessed kept playing in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. What had he seen at that door? A child, yes, but something much more than that. A soul trapped in a life that clearly wasn't nourishing it. Not with food, not with love, not with the bare minimum of care. The clock moved slowly, but Mike knew he couldn't just let this situation disappear from his mind. He needed to understand more, to find out what was really happening with that boy. The next morning, unable to ignore the instinct telling him to return, Mike decided to go back to that house once more. The day was bright, but the weight in his chest didn't lessen as he approached the residence. When he parked the car in front of the house, he took a deep breath and got out, feeling the tension increase with each step. He knocked on the door, and this time, instead of waiting in silence, he could hear faint noises on the other side. The door opened, and there was the boy again, with the same tired look as before, but this time something seemed different. "Hi," Mike said with a smile, trying to be reassuring, but the discomfort was palpable. "Are your parents around?" "I'd like to talk to them." The boy hesitated for a moment, staring at the ground before opening the door a little wider. "They're not," he said in a softer voice than Mike expected. "Do you want to come in?" Mike's surprise was immediate. "Come in?" He wasn't sure if he should, but the boy's tone carried no threat or malice, just a kind of resignation. "All right," he said after a brief silence, the feeling that something very serious was happening in that house only intensifying as he crossed the threshold. Mike was greeted by a sight that left him speechless. The living room was a mess. Clothes were strewn across the floor, furniture was out of place, and most alarmingly, there was no sign of food or any semblance of organization. It was as if the house had been abandoned by those who were supposed to take care of it. "What's your name?" Mike asked gently, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Tommy," the boy responded quietly. "Tommy," Mike began, unable to hide the concern in his voice. "What's going on here? Where are your parents?" Tommy, for his part, seemed ready for that conversation, though his words were tinged with a subtle sadness. "They don't care much, you know," he responded with a naturalness that made Mike's heart ache. "They go out and I don't know when they'll be back. Sometimes there's food, sometimes there isn't, but I get by." Shock overtook Mike. He didn't know how to respond immediately. "You get by?" "What do you mean? How old are you, Tommy?" "I'm 9, the boy replied with a distant expression. Mike felt a lump form in his throat. How could a 9-year-old child be living in such neglect? The living room seemed to reflect the emotional state of the boy, a place of abandonment where everything that should represent safety and care was slowly falling apart. The kitchen, which Mike glimpsed as he passed by, reinforced what Tommy had said. The refrigerator was practically empty, with only a few random dusty items. "This isn't right, kid. You can't live like this," Mike said, trying to control the tremor in his voice. Tommy looked at him with those same vacant eyes as before, as if he had already accepted this as his reality. "I'm used to it," the boy muttered, as if the very idea of care was something distant and irrelevant. Mike could barely believe what he was hearing. "Used to it? No one should live like this, Tommy. It's not right." He felt a mixture of anger and sadness as his mind tried to process the gravity of the situation. The boy just shrugged again, as if there was nothing more to say. But for Mike, this was just the beginning. He knew he couldn't simply walk away and pretend this wasn't happening. Something inside him compelled him to act, to do something to change this absurd and painful reality. As he looked around the disorganized and crumbling house, Mike realized that this moment was crucial. Tommy's situation was much more serious than he had imagined. extreme neglect, constant hunger, loneliness. Every detail revealed in that brief conversation made Mike's heart tighten even more. He would need to make a decision, and quickly. Mike was still processing what he had just heard from Tommy when the sound of a key turning in the lock snapped him back to reality. The front door opened abruptly, and two adults entered with heavy, clumsy steps. Robert and Linda Wilson, Tommy's parents, arrived with exasperated expressions, as if simply being there was an inconvenience. When they saw Mike standing in the living room, their eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" Robert asked, his voice full of disdain, frowning as if he was already ready for a fight. Mike straightened up, feeling the discomfort growing in his chest, but he knew he couldn't just leave without speaking. "My name is Mike. I'm a food delivery guy. I came here yesterday, and today I came back to check on Tommy." The words came out calmly, but his heart was racing. He could feel the tension growing with each passing second, especially as he saw Linda's expression harden. "Why are you inside my house?" she snapped, not even bothering to hide her irritation. She glanced quickly at Tommy, but she didn't seem like a concerned mother, just someone annoyed by something disrupting her comfort. "Look, I didn't mean to intrude, but when I came yesterday, I saw Tommy. He didn't look well, and now after seeing the house, I have to say I'm worried about him. There isn't enough food here, and the boy is clearly malnourished," Mike explained, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside he felt the weight of every word. He didn't know how the parents would react, but he had to try. He had to be the voice Tommy never had. Robert took a step forward, crossing his arms over his chest, and a dry laugh escaped his lips. "So now you're a doctor, or maybe a social worker?" "Man, you don't even know us. You have no right to come in here and make accusations." The fury in Robert's eyes was evident, but Mike didn't back down. He knew that as risky as it was, he had to confront them. "I know it seems intrusive, but I'm not here to judge you. I just want to understand what's going on because, honestly, Tommy needs help. He's weak, and he told me he sometimes goes without food." Mike's words seemed to trigger an explosion. Linda stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Going without food? What are you insinuating, huh? We take care of him in our own way. He's our son, and you have nothing to do with this." Linda's anger was so palpable that it seemed to fill the air, suffocating any room for argument. Mike took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the situation was already spiraling out of control. "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm just saying that a child needs basic care, and he's not getting it." The tension in the room reached its peak. Robert strode forward with large steps, his face contorted in fury, and pointed a threatening finger in Mike's direction. "You're going to leave my house now, do you hear me, before we have a real problem." His voice was a muffled shout, the kind of threat that makes your blood run faster in your veins. Linda stood by her husband's side, as if they were ready to throw Mike out by force if necessary. But before any action could be taken, something shocking happened. In the middle of that atmosphere, thick with hatred and resentment, Tommy, who had been silently watching until then, stepped forward, his eyes rolling back, and he collapsed to the floor with a dull thud. "Tommy!" Mike's shout was immediate, and he rushed to the boy kneeling beside him. "Tommy, can you hear me? Stay with me, kid." Mike's voice was filled with desperation as he tried to wake the boy, shaking him gently. Tommy's skin was cold, and he showed no sign of returning to consciousness. Tommy's parents were momentarily frozen, as if they didn't know how to react. Linda brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, but Robert still seemed to be in denial. "He's just tired. It's nothing serious. He's fainted before. It's not your problem," Robert said, trying to downplay the severity of the situation. Mike, however, knew that the situation was far too serious to be ignored. "He needs medical help now. We can't keep pretending that everything's fine. This could be really bad." The truth at that moment was undeniable. Tommy's fragile body on the floor, the chaotic house around them, and the parents incapable of reacting as they should. Mike felt his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at Robert and Linda. They no longer had control of the situation. Now it was a matter of life and death. "If you don't call 911, I will, and I'll call the police too. I'm not going to let you keep doing this," Mike said, the determination in his voice firm and clear. There was no more room for hesitation. Tommy's well-being was above everything else. The tension was suffocating, and Mike knew that the situation was about to explode. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The boy on the floor was living proof that something was very wrong in that house, and Mike wasn't going to leave without doing something about it. Without waiting for a response from Robert or Linda, he pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance now," he said, his voice strained with urgency. "It's a child. He fainted. He's in very serious condition." The moment of truth had arrived. There was no turning back now. The desperation in Mike's chest grew as he looked at Tommy's inert body on the floor. There was no more time to waste. The tension in the room was palpable while they waited for help to arrive, each second stretching into what felt like hours. As Mike spoke on the phone, Linda finally started to show signs of panic. "He'll be okay, won't he?" "He always recovers," she mumbled, as if trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Robert, on the other hand, remained immobile, arms crossed, his face hardened, still unwilling to accept the gravity of the situation. Mike ignored both of them, focusing on what was most important at that moment, saving Tommy. Every second without medical attention felt like an eternity, and the growing guilt of not having done something sooner gnawed at his thoughts. In a matter of minutes, which felt like hours, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Mike felt a brief but intense relief as he heard the sound of the approaching ambulance. He kept his eyes fixed on Tommy, lightly touching his shoulder in the hope that any sign of consciousness would emerge. "Everything's going to be okay, kid." "They're coming," he murmured, as if those words could somehow protect him from the worst. When the paramedics finally entered through the door, Mike stepped back, giving them space to do their work, but his heart was tied to what would happen next. The paramedics worked quickly, checking Tommy's vital signs and preparing to rush him to the hospital. One of them briefly glanced at Mike, noticing his expression of fear and concern. "He's dehydrated and very weak, but we'll get him immediate care," they explained. Mike just nodded, but the lump in his throat didn't allow him to respond. He watched as they placed Tommy on the stretcher and took him out of the house, leaving behind a suffocating emptiness. However, the chaos was far from over. Right after the ambulance left, the sound of a second siren invaded the street. This time, it was the police cars. Mike's heart raced, and he knew the next step would be even more delicate. 2 officers entered the house, their serious eyes surveying the chaotic environment. "We received a report of child neglect," one of them said, his voice firm and straightforward. Robert and Linda, who had been frozen by the reality unfolding before them, began to protest. "This is ridiculous. We're his parents. No one has the right to accuse us of this," Robert shouted, standing up and gesturing angrily. Mike quickly explained to the officers what had happened. He talked about Tommy's condition, about the disorganized house and lack of food, about the boys fainting and the urgent need for intervention. The officers listened attentively, and as Mike spoke, one of them took notes with seriousness. Robert continued to protest, accusing Mike of trespassing and claiming they were being treated unfairly, but Linda's expression had changed. Now there was a growing fear in her eyes, as if she knew there was no longer any way to hide the truth. Within minutes, both parents were placed under arrest. As they were led away in handcuffs, Mike felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that Tommy would finally get help, but also a deep sadness for everything the boy had endured. Without thinking much, he got into his car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. The flashing lights reflected in his rearview mirror as he drove, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How had it come to this? How could such a young child be left to endure so much neglect? At the hospital, Mike hastily approached the reception. "The boy who was just brought in, Tommy Wilson, how is he?" The receptionist quickly checked the computer and directed Mike to the waiting area, promising updates as soon as possible. Hours passed in that sterile environment before a doctor finally approached. "Are you here for Tommy Wilson?" the doctor asked, his expression serious but slightly reassuring. Mike stood up immediately. "Yes, how is he?" The doctor took a deep breath before responding. "Tommy was extremely malnourished and dehydrated. We're treating him now, but what concerns us most is his emotional state. Children in neglect situations like this need much more than medical care." Just then, a woman in professional attire approached them. "Mr. Anderson, I'm Sarah Matthews from Child Protective Services. We need to talk about Tommy's situation." Mike felt his heart rate increase. He knew this conversation would be important. "Tommy has no other relatives who can take care of him," Sarah explained gently. "Given the circumstances and the bond you've shown with him, would you consider becoming his temporary guardian until we can find a permanent solution?" The question hung in the air, heavy with responsibility. Mike looked through the window of Tommy's room, where the boy lay connected to IVs, looking even smaller and more vulnerable in the hospital bed. This wasn't a decision to be made lightly, but as Mike watched Tommy's chest rise and fall in his drug-induced sleep, he knew he couldn't walk away. This boy had already been failed by too many people. "I'll need some guidance," Mike said finally, his voice soft but determined. "But yes, I'll do it. I'll take care of him." The first few days with Tommy at Mike's house were a mixture of uncertainties and discoveries. Everything felt different now. The responsibility of caring for a child was present in every little action Mike took, from breakfast to bedtime. Though he was nervous at first, seeing himself in a role he had never imagined assuming, Mike also felt a growing sense of purpose. When he woke up, he no longer thought only about work or daily tasks, but about how he could make Tommy feel safe, loved, and cared for. It was a new life for both of them, and Mike knew that this beginning would be crucial. In the beginning, Tommy was reserved, as if he was still trying to understand whether this new reality was permanent or just another phase of instability. He seemed cautious, as if waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart again. Mike could feel this insecurity in the boy's interactions, especially in the small questions he asked. "How long will I stay here?" Tommy asked one evening, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to leave me too?" Another time, during breakfast. Each of these questions broke Mike's heart, knowing that building Tommy's trust would take time. "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere," Mike repeated whenever the subject came up, trying to reassure him even though he wasn't sure if his words made sense to the boy yet. The nights were the hardest. Tommy would often wake up screaming from nightmares, his small body trembling with fear. Mike would rush to his room, sitting on the edge of the bed, speaking softly until the boy's breathing steadied. "It's okay, Tommy. You're safe here," he would say, sometimes staying for hours until Tommy fell back asleep. These moments, though challenging, began to forge a deeper bond between them. Over the weeks, Mike began to create a routine for the two of them. Waking up at 7 a.m., preparing a simple breakfast, taking Tommy to school, all of this seemed ordinary. But for Mike, each small gesture was proof that they were starting to build something together. Tommy, on the other hand, was beginning to adapt to this new structure. Though his smiles were still rare and his words still limited, Mike noticed that the boy had a natural talent for drawing. He began to encourage this interest, buying notebooks and colored pencils. "You're really good at drawing," Mike praised one day when he saw Tommy sketching figures in a corner of the table. Tommy looked at him with a shy smile, perhaps the first genuine smile Mike had seen him give. As the days passed, the bond between the two became more solid. Though Tommy still had moments of insecurity, he clearly started to feel more comfortable in Mike's home. The conversations, which had once been brief and superficial, began to gain depth. One night, while Mike prepared dinner, Tommy spoke about his past for the first time. "We almost never had dinner together," he said quietly, watching Mike stir the pasta sauce. "My parents were gone for a long time." Mike listened patiently, letting Tommy share at his own pace. He learned to recognize when the boy needed space and when he needed comfort. The trauma Tommy carried didn't disappear easily, but Mike, even without experience, did everything he could to help heal those wounds. Small victories began to accumulate. Tommy started eating regular meals without hesitation. His nightmares, though still present, became less frequent. At school, his teachers reported that he was more engaged, even making a few friends. One Saturday morning, about a month after Tommy had moved in, Mike found him in the living room, surrounded by his drawings. They were pictures of two people, one tall, one small, doing everyday things together, eating breakfast, walking in a park, watching TV. "Is this us?" Mike asked gently, picking up one of the drawings. Tommy nodded, then pointed to another picture, this one showing the two figures standing in front of a house. "This is home," he said simply. Mike felt his heart swell. It was the first time Tommy had referred to their house as home. That single word carried more meaning than any lengthy conversation could. The challenges weren't over, of course. Tommy still had appointments with his therapist, still had days when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear. But now he had something he'd never had before: stability, care, and someone who wouldn't give up on him. Mike, too, was changing. The responsibility of caring for Tommy had given his life new meaning. His delivery job, once his sole focus, now felt secondary to his role as Tommy's guardian. He arranged his schedule to be home more, learned to cook proper meals, and even joined a support group for foster parents. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching Tommy's favorite cartoon, the boy leaned against Mike's shoulder and quietly fell asleep. Mike looked down at Tommy's peaceful face, remembering that first night at the hospital. How fragile and lost the boy had seemed. They still had a long way to go, but in that moment, Mike knew they were exactly where they needed to be. This wasn't just a new beginning anymore, it was becoming their story. As time passed, Mike also began to notice a change within himself. Caring for Tommy was no longer just a duty. It had become something he deeply valued. Before, his life had been a routine without much meaning. Now, he felt a new energy, a new reason to keep going. Every little progress Tommy made, whether it was a smile, a longer conversation, or a peaceful night, was a victory Mike celebrated internally. He began to realize that, as challenging as the journey was, it was also extremely rewarding. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Tommy's transformation was gradual but undeniable. The boy who had once been withdrawn and always waiting for the next abandonment now showed more confidence. His drawings, once filled with dark colors and lonely figures, started featuring brighter scenes and two people together, him and Mike. "Look what I made at school today," Tommy said one afternoon, proudly holding up a family drawing. Mike noticed that for the first time, both figures in the picture were smiling. A small detail, but one that spoke volumes about Tommy's healing process. The nights became easier too. When nightmares did come, Tommy no longer hesitated to seek comfort. He would pad quietly to Mike's room, and without words, Mike would make space on the bed. These silent moments of trust meant everything. Their routine had become natural now. Breakfast together, school drop-offs, afternoon homework, dinner at the kitchen table. Simple things that most families took for granted. But for them, Each moment was a precious piece of their new life. "My teacher asked about you today," Tommy mentioned during dinner one evening. "Oh? What did she ask?" Mike responded, curious. "She wanted to know if you were my dad now," Tommy said quietly, watching Mike's reaction carefully. "I told her you were better than a dad." Mike felt his heart skip a beat. He had been thinking more and more about making their arrangement permanent, but hearing Tommy's words gave him a new certainty. The social worker, Sarah, noticed the changes too during her monthly visits. "Tommy's progress is remarkable," she said during one check-in. "His physical health has improved significantly, but more importantly, he's emotionally secure now. That's all thanks to you, Mike." Mike had also joined a support group for foster parents, where he shared their story and learned from others' experiences. The other parents often commented on how naturally he had taken to caring for Tommy, despite his initial doubts. One Saturday morning, as they were making pancakes together, something that had become their weekend tradition, Tommy spilled some batter on the floor. For a moment he froze, his body tensing as if expecting punishment. But then he looked at Mike, saw his reassuring smile, and relaxed. Together they cleaned up the mess, laughing about it. It was these small moments that showed how far they'd come. Tommy was learning that mistakes were okay, that love didn't have conditions, that home could be a safe place. Mike found himself thinking about the future more often. He thought about Tommy's next school year, about teaching him to ride a bike, about all the normal childhood experiences the boy had missed out on. He wanted to be there for all of it. The delivery job that had once been his whole life now took a back seat to his role as Tommy's guardian. He had switched to day shifts only, arranged his schedule around Tommy's school hours, and even started taking online courses in child development. "You know what, buddy?" Mike said one evening as they walked home from the park, Tommy's hand trustingly in his. "Having you in my life has been the best thing that ever happened to me." Tommy squeezed his hand in response, and Mike knew. They weren't just guardian and ward anymore. They were family. This progress, built day by day, moment by moment, was leading them both toward a decision that felt more right with each passing day. Mike was no longer just thinking about being Tommy's temporary guardian. In his heart, he already knew this was meant to be permanent. As months had passed since Tommy moved in with Mike, the life they had built together began to feel less like a temporary situation and more like a real home. Mike, who once questioned his ability to care for a child, now saw in his daily life that he was more than capable. More and more he realized how much Tommy had recovered, not just physically, but also emotionally. The boy who had once been withdrawn and always waiting for the next abandonment now showed confidence. He still had his moments of insecurity, of course, but the change was clear. It was as if finally Tommy was beginning to believe that this new home was real. However, as life went on, the idea of adopting Tommy became stronger and more real in Mike's mind. He knew he could no longer imagine his life without the boy. The routines they had created, the deepening conversations, and the growing affection between the two made it clear that something deeper was blossoming. One afternoon, after picking Tommy up from school, Mike decided it was time to have an honest conversation with himself. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Tommy draw calmly, the boy's demeanor much more relaxed than when he had first met him. It was this moment of peace, this sense of normalcy, that made Mike know deep in his heart that he needed to make the final decision. "I want to adopt Tommy," he said to himself in a low voice, the weight of the decision finally settling in his chest as a certainty. Mike scheduled a meeting with Sarah, the social worker, to discuss the next steps. He was nervous, afraid that something might interfere with his decision, but he knew there was no turning back. When he arrived at Sarah's office, she greeted him with a warm smile, already knowing the reason for his visit. "So, Mike, how are things with Tommy?" she asked. already guessing that something important would come from that conversation. Mike took a deep breath, looking her in the eye with firmness. "I want to adopt Tommy. I can't imagine my life without him anymore, and I know he needs a permanent home. I want that home to be mine." The words came out with a clarity that even surprised Mike. Sarah, for her part, seemed moved by the statement. "I'm so happy to hear that, Mike. We knew that you and Tommy had formed a strong bond, and he really needs that security. We'll start the legal process as soon as possible." That evening, while they were having dinner together, Mike took a deep breath and decided it was the right time. "Tommy," he began, looking at the boy who now felt more like a son than anything else, "I've been thinking a lot lately, and I need to tell you something important." Tommy looked at him with curiosity, but with a slight trace of nervousness in his eyes. "I want you to know that I'd like to adopt you, Tommy. I want you to have a permanent home, a place where you know you're loved and cared for forever. What do you think about that?" The room seemed to fall into total silence as Tommy processed the words. The boy remained quiet for a few seconds, as if trying to understand what it all meant. His eyes, however, began to shine, and he looked at Mike with a mixture of surprise and hope. "You want me to stay here forever?" he asked, his voice slightly trembling as if he still had difficulty believing it. "Yes, Tommy." Mike leaned forward a little, his heart racing. "I want this to be your home forever. I want to be your family." Tommy didn't say anything immediately, but then, slowly, a shy smile began to form on his lips, a smile Mike had never seen before, a smile of true happiness. Without saying another word, Tommy simply stood up and hugged him. The silent gesture, yet powerful, said more than any words could. The days that followed were filled with legal paperwork and meetings, but Mike felt that with each step overcome, they were getting closer to making official what their hearts already knew. They were meant to be father and son. When the adoption process was finally completed, Mike felt an indescribable relief and joy as he signed the papers. He knew that this decision would change both their lives forever. Tommy, who had entered his life unexpectedly during a routine delivery, was now officially his son. 1 year after that fateful night, their home had become filled with laughter and warmth. Tommy's drawings, now bright and cheerful, covered the refrigerator door. His nightmares had become rare, replaced by peaceful sleep and morning smiles. At school, he had blossomed into a confident, happy child who no longer flinched at unexpected movements or hoarded food in his room. The story of Mike and Tommy shows us how love and responsibility can transform lives. Mike, who started as just a concerned delivery man, ended up becoming the father figure that Tommy so desperately needed. This journey, full of challenges and difficult decisions, reminds us of the power of human actions to heal deep wounds and how the simple act of caring can create new beginnings. Now I invite you to reflect. How would you react if you had the chance to change someone's life? Sometimes it's in the simplest choices that we find our true purpose. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications to follow more transformative stories like this one. See you next time.